Good morning, fellas, and welcome back to My Prize Garage. My name is Matt, and Match Game is a show I find absolutely fascinating. So today I want to take you through the history of the show, starting in the 1960s and working our way up to the present day. If you want to skip to a specific version of the show, there will be chapters on this video. Alright, let's get started. The story of Match Game starts with two producers, Mark Goodson and Bill Todman. They started out doing radio shows in the 1940s, but they eventually made the jump to television. Prior to this show, they were responsible for games like Beat the Clock, What's My Line, and To Tell the Truth. They've also created some shows that are still on to this day, namely The Price is Right and another one we'll get back to later. They created the Match Game in 1962, and the first episode premiered on New Year's Eve. It was hosted by Gene Rayburn, who already had several game show hosting jobs under his belt, namely Make the Connection, Tic-Tac-Dough, and Do-Re-Mi. I wrote a joke here, but it would expose how little Tic-Tac-Dough I've watched in my life, so never mind. The Match Game pitted two teams of two contestants and one celebrity against each other. Rayburn would ask everybody a question like, name the word you think you use most often when you talk, which might remind you of another show, but we'll get back to that. Everybody would write down an answer and reveal them. If two people on the same team gave the same answer, they got 25 points. If all three team members matched, they got 50 points. First team to 100 points wins $100, which adjusted for inflation is about $900 today. Then the winners try to earn more money in the audience match bonus round. By successfully guessing how an audience responded to a survey question, you could potentially win another $450, equivalent to about $4,200 today. So at this point, the show wasn't quite what we know it as today, but even back then, everybody was always looking for ways to keep the show spicy. God, now I kinda wanna see a Match Game, but everybody eats Carolina Reapers as the game starts. Anyway, one week Bill Cullen was one of the guests, and he rounded up the four contestants, the other guest Fanny Flagg, and question writer Dick DeBartolo before the show. He told them that no matter what the first question was, everybody should write pickle. So they go on the show when Gene reads the question. What was the question? Not important. Everybody on Bill's team reveals pickle as their answers. So then Gene turns to the first person on Fanny's team and says, if you wrote pickle, I'm walking off the stage and Johnny Olson is taking over. Guess what they wrote? So Olson takes over and tells the next contestant if they say pickle, he's walking off and DeBartolo would take over. Ding. 5 pickles and 2 hosts have disappeared in the span of a couple minutes. Awesome. DeBartolo was in on the joke, so he turned to Fanny and said, if you wrote pickle, I'm gonna stay right where I am. One interesting thing to note is that the questions were being fed to Gene in real time. If the players were struggling, DeBartolo would pick out an easy question. If they were doing well, he'd pick a harder question to slow things down a little bit. Picking questions mid-game is something other game shows have gone on to do as well, because controlling the pace of the show is important when you have a specific amount of time on the air. In 1967, they introduced the telephone match, where they called a random viewer and paired them with a studio audience member. If they matched on a fill-in-the-blank prompt, they would split a rolling jackpot that started at $500, and increased by $100 for each consecutive loss. But in 1969, NBC canceled the Match Game, along with their other game shows. With 6 weeks of episodes left to tape before the show was over, they decided to switch up the questions. DeBartolo took a more humorous approach and started writing sillier questions. Because screw it! We're gonna be off the air next month, so may as well go crazy, right? Mary likes to pour gravy on John's blank. Screw everything! Regardless, the show came to an end after those last 6 weeks were up, but Goodson Todman wasn't ready to give up on Match Game just yet. Eventually, the show was brought back in 1973 on CBS, and this is where it really hit its stride. The new show started out with more basic questions. Stuff like, John likes blank movies. Mary decided to have a blank. But after some time, they decided to do goofier stuff. Did you hear what happened last night at the circus? Bozo the Clown got fired because the boss didn't think it was funny when Bozo fed the blank to the lions. Goodson Todman called the new show Match Game 73, with the number being updated every time the calendar flipped over to a new year. Gene Rayburn and Johnny Olson both returned for a brand new format. Instead of each team having one celebrity, the show featured 2 opposing contestants and a panel of 6 celebrities. These panelists answered questions for both players, and the contestants got 1 point for each match they got. Each contestant got 2 chances to match as many times as they could, with 1 wrinkle. Each celebrity they matched in round 1 didn't play in round 2, so the maximum possible score is 6. In the event of a tie, they played tiebreaker questions until somebody won or Gene fell asleep, whichever comes first. This time, each contestant got their own questions. The winner moves on to the bonus round, the Super Match. This round is played in 2 parts. First up, a new format for the audience match. The contestant is shown a phrase with 1 blank, and they have to guess the most popular answer. The number 1 answer was worth $500, then they also have the second and third answers, worth $250 and $100 respectively. Again, might remind you of another show, we'll get back to that. Anyway, once that's done, it's time for the head-to-head match. The contestant picks a celebrity, and gets another fill-in-the-blank prompt. If they match each other, the contestant wins 10 times whatever they won in the audience match. The audience match board was also manually operated. The guy behind the board was named Earl, and although he rarely appeared on screen, Gene would say "Slide it, Earl" when it was time to reveal the top answer. On most game shows, each episode starts with the beginning of the game and ends with the final round. On Match Game, though, games straddled across episodes. Monday's show might end halfway through a round, then on Tuesday they'd start with the second question of that round. Some episodes would start with the bonus round, or even halfway through it. And that works well for this show, because in this format, Match Game is less about the game and more about the stars. Gene Rayburn didn't really like the format of Match Game 73, but he liked the show because of the interactions between the celebrities. That was the show's secret sauce, they leaned into it. The show started out kind of rough, because it was slated to premiere on June 25th, 1973 on CBS. But between May and August of that year, ABC, CBS, and NBC were airing coverage of the Watergate hearings. The whole first week of shows got preempted, and they wound up finally airing the first episode a week later on July 2nd. But with Watergate hearings continuing, Match Game 73 struggled to find an audience in the early going. With so many preemptions, viewers had fewer chances to watch Match Game and get used to the format, which the show worried would turn people away. But a few weeks after Watergate hearings ended, Match Game 73 found its footing, and became one of the most popular shows on TV. One thing that made Match Game a hit was the regular panelists. Richard Dawson, Brett Somers, and Charles Nelson Riley all appeared on nearly every episode together. Dawson was on the show from the very first episode, after rising to fame by playing Corporal Peter Newkirk on Hogan's Heroes. He sat in the middle seat of the bottom row. Jack Klugman was also a panelist on the premiere week. At the time, he played Oscar Madison on the sitcom The Odd Couple. His real-life wife, Brett Somers, was also a recurring actress on the show, playing Oscar's ex, Blanche. Klugman asked Match Game 73's producer, Ira Skutch, to book Somers to be on the show for a week or two, since she was looking for other work. She ended up fitting in fantastically, and after a couple of weeks, she was signed to a contract and became a permanent fixture on the show. Ironically, she hated the original 60s version of the show. Like, throw yourself across the room to turn it off hated it. So it was clear that the new format was paying dividends. Charles Nelson Riley was the final regular panelist to be signed to the show. He was a guest a couple of times on Match Game 73, because Skutch first met Riley the year prior on I've Got a Secret. Skutch knew that Charles would be a good fit for the show, so he made his debut a couple weeks into the show's run, the same week Brett Somers and Betty White first appeared. Riley signed a contract after a couple of guest appearances, eventually getting seated next to Brett. Here he is playing tic-tac-toe with Richard on Gene Rayburn's vest.
You're gonna cut there, Doctor?
Yes.
Now cut that out! Get out of here, you guys!
Gene wins. So at this point, half the panel was made up of regulars, and the show had a standard seating arrangement. On the top row, they had the male guest of the week on the left, followed by Somers and Riley, who effectively served as palate cleanser, so to speak. The guests had less experience with Match Game, so the show hoped that if they gave the stupidest answer in the world, people would forget about it once they saw Brett and Charles' answers. Their answers might also suck, but what can you do? Brett and Charles were also seated next to each other because of their strong chemistry with each other on the show. Heck, during a lot of tapings, Gene Rayburn would do a Q&A with the audience, and one common question was whether Somers and Riley were married. The bottom row consisted of the week's female guest on the left, Richard Dawson in the middle, and one of several semi-regular women on the right. The semi-regulars included Betty White, Fannie Flagg, Joyce Bulifant, Marcia Wallace, and Patty Deutsch. Once again, Dawson and the semi-regular served as palate cleansers for the bottom row. Guest gives a lousy answer, and Richard and Co. bail them out. And the audience was a big part of the show as well. On most game shows, the crowd will clap and cheer for a good contestant, and that's all well and good. But there's not that many game shows where that same audience will register on the Richter scale if they're booing as well. If a contestant says some nonsense, the audience will let them know. I can think of another show that could use more boos. Actually, no, scratch that. That'd take up like half the show's runtime. Aside from that, one of the most popular types of questions were ones about Dumb Dora or Dumb Donald. They would start something like, "Dumb Dora is so dumb," and then the audience would respond with, "How dumb is she?" Similar to The Tonight Show starring Johnny Carson. The show also started including questions about other characters like Unlucky Louie and Louise, Horrible Hank and Hannah, Weird Willie, Old Man Periwinkle, Ugly Edna, and Rodney Rotten. Quite a step up from John and Mary, if you ask me. They also occasionally did questions about the panelists. Like if Betty White was on the show, they might do one about her and her husband, Alan Ludden. The folks on the show also love dunking on Howard Cosell, so he comes up as an answer quite a bit. Anytime a question about talking too much comes up, chances are Howard Cosell is going to be a good answer. Heck, Gene Rayburn once said that when in doubt, you should answer with boobs, booze, or Howard Cosell. At this point, Match Game was a massive hit. It was breaking ratings records left and right, so to capitalize on its success, Goodson and Todman wanted to make a primetime version of the show. But they needed permission from CBS to bring the format to syndication, so it took them until 1975 to launch Match Game PM. It took 2 years because CBS was concerned about a nighttime show hurting the daytime version's ratings, since that's what happened when the Peter Marshall-hosted Hollywood Squares began airing at night. But after a while, CBS agreed to do Match Game PM, and it was picked up by CBS, NBC, and ABC stations across the US. Originally, the daytime and nighttime shows would have separate taping days, with 11 or 12 panelists on hand to do 4 Match Game PM episodes in one day. After a couple months, they switched to a more practical system. They would do 5 episodes of the daytime show, then at the very end they'd do 1 episode of Match Game PM with the same 6 celebrities, for a total of 6 episodes taped per day. At first, they played 2 rounds like on the daytime show, and the winner moved on to the super match. On Match Game PM, though, they played 2 audience matches worth $500 apiece, followed by a head-to-head match that was worth 10 times what the contestant won, allowing for a possible payout of $10,000. For the second season of Match Game PM, a 3rd round was added to make it easier to fit a half-hour time slot. Gene Rayburn and Mark Goodson never quite saw eye to eye when it came to Match Game's format. Goodson wanted Rayburn and the panelists to focus more on the game, which Gene wasn't a fan of, because in his eyes, all the banter and goofing off was part of what gave the show its identity. Goodson, on the other hand, didn't like what he was seeing with the daytime match game at all. He preferred the nighttime one by a long shot. Not only did they save most of the best questions for Match Game PM, but there was more emphasis on the game at night. Adding a 3rd round and not having games straddle episodes meant there was less time to mess around on Match Game PM, so nighttime viewers were getting more bang for their buck per episode. For the daytime match game, CBS censors would review the questions before they made it to air, and that held true for Match Game PM. When it came time to tape the show, though, there were also NBC and ABC censors present, since the show would be airing on some of their stations as well. With 3 censors in the room, the stars had to be extra careful with what they said. CBS had their list of rules, NBC had their list, and ABC had their list. One network would say not to use the word pregnant, another would tell you can't say virgin. Heck, even on the daytime show there were quite a few restrictions. Even though the show did push the envelope with some of their questions and answers, you still had to use euphemisms like tinkle and doo-doo. You could say boob, but they didn't really want you saying poop. Huh. Well, I've been hinting at this other show all video, so now's as good a time as any to talk about Family Feud. It's not often the game shows get spin-offs, but the folks at Goodson Todman were working on a new show that combined elements from the 2 versions of Match Game up to that point. They wound up taking the more pedestrian questions from the 60s show and combining them with the ranked answers from the 70s version's Super Match. At first, the show was going to be called On a Roll, featuring 2 contestants trying to name as many answers on the survey as possible. But there were a lot of answers on the board, and contestants had trouble coming up with more than 2 or 3 on their own. So they realized this was the perfect format to turn into a team game. And Family Feud was born. And although 5 people would still have trouble finding every single answer, they're obviously able to knock more off the board than 1 person could alone. 5 heads are better than 1, fellas. That's how it goes, right? And who better to host Family Feud than a panelist from the show that inspired it? Richard Dawson had a clause in his contract that gave him a chance to host a Goodson Todman game show when the opportunity came up, so he did a Family Feud pilot for ABC. They picked it up for their daytime schedule, and the show premiered in 1976, followed shortly by a nighttime syndicated version the next year. But after some time, problems started to arise. Dawson was still under contract with Match Game, and Goodson Todman refused to release him. So he was in this weird limbo where he was completely in control of one show, but playing second fiddle to the host on another. And that's a weird dynamic, especially because he still appeared on both shows every day. And this host-panelist double duty is something we're going to see come up later on as well. It was clear to the folks working on the show that Dawson didn't really want to be on Match Game anymore, but he was still under contract. He enjoyed his time on the show, but he felt it was time to move on. On top of that, Dawson wasn't happy with a pretty significant rule change they made in 1978. For years up to that point, Richard was completely in control of the Super Match round. During the audience match, contestants would almost always ask him for help, and they also nearly always picked him for the head-to-head match. Many contestants picked him because they thought he was the best at it, but according to CBS, his success rate was pretty much the same as every other panelist. People just thought he was the best because he was the only star contestant chose to play with regularly. In 1975, they added a rule saying if you won multiple games, you can't pick the same celebrity for the head-to-head match twice in a row. That wound up being thrown out after a month and a half, though, and the head-to-head match went back to being the Richard Dawson show. Match Game's next effort to give other celebrities a chance to play was the Star Wheel in 1978. Instead of picking your partner for the head-to-head match, you had to spin a wheel that would pick them for you. But in exchange, you had a chance to win double the money if the wheel landed in one of the Gold Star areas. So that bumped up the potential prize money to $10,000 on the daytime show and $20,000 on Match Game PM. Ironically, the first time they spun the wheel, it landed on Richard, so they gave up and threw that out too. I'm lying. It did land on Richard the first time, though, prompting nearly the whole panel to walk off in disbelief. There are 2 ways to look at the Star Wheel. On one hand, it gave the guest panelists a chance to play the head-to-head match. A lot of the time, guests would be on for a week, and the contestants would just pick Richard every single time. So the star wheel meant they wouldn't just sit around twiddling their thumbs during the head-to-head match every show, waiting for the next game to start. But Dawson saw it differently. In an interview later on, he said, "I took that as a direct slight at me." And it makes sense why he felt that way, since he was by far the most popular choice. But after years of contestants picking Brett, Charles, and Richard for the audience match, then Richard again for the head-to-head match, the show decided it was time for the guests to have a chance to play. So while I do understand why the change frustrated Dawson, I think the Star Wheel was a good move in the end. One day, Dawson showed up to Match Game 78 wearing sunglasses. He'd worn them during the previous Family Feud taping day as well, but Match Game staff didn't know that at the time, since there wasn't much communication between the two shows. Ira Skutch thought it was an attempt from Dawson to isolate himself, because his mood toward Match Game had soured since taking the Family Feud gig. During a break in the taping day, Skutch told Dawson he was done with Match Game. During the intro of his last episode, he held up a card saying, "Fare thee well." Finally, after 2 years of being on both shows, and 1 year of doing daytime and nighttime versions of both, Richard was free from his contract and he could focus more of his efforts on Family Feud. Nowadays, Family Feud is the stupidest show on syndicated television. Moving on. Time slots, time slots, time slots. If you had a show called This Evening at 8 with John Television, what time would you air it? If you said anything other than 8 p.m., please join me and we can all make awful jokes together at my comedy club in Antarctica. Anyway, my point here is that what time your show is on is incredibly important in a lot of ways. Match Game 77 aired at 3:30 p.m., and its ratings were fantastic. Dick DeBartolo once said, "When you're getting history-making, record-breaking ratings for a TV show, and the time slot is 3:30 p.m., it doesn't take a genius to figure out that a big chunk of your audience must be kids." And yeah, a lot of kids around the country were tuning in to watch Match Game after school. Apparently a lot of them ate tomato soup during the show as well. Couldn't tell you why soup, but hey. Regardless, Match Game 77 was moved to earlier in the day, now airing at 11 a.m. And last time I checked, most algebra teachers aren't going to pull out a TV in the middle of class to see Betty White talk about how much she hates the show's animal questions. Rayburn hated the move as well, saying our time slot was changed by a guy at CBS who had the IQ of his shoe size. A lot of the show's viewers suddenly couldn't watch the daytime version anymore. To get their fix of the show, they'd have to wait for Match Game PM to roll around. Match Game 77 was moved to 4 o'clock just a month and a half later, but at that point a lot of CBS stations had dropped it in favor of local news and such. So even though its time slot wasn't far off from where it was before, the show just wasn't reaching the same audience, and eventually was cancelled shortly after flipping the calendar to Match Game 79. There's a new set now. That's neat. Show's still dead though. Or was it? Goodson Todman wasn't ready to give up on Match Game just yet. The nighttime syndicated show was still on the air, and eventually they started airing a daytime syndicated version as well. This show was simply called Match Game. They had to get rid of the year in the title, because of a common practice with syndicated shows back then called bicycling. The show would only make a few copies of each episode. Then they'd send the tapes to the biggest stations in the country first. Then once the episode aired, they'd be sent to a smaller market to air later. And then they'd keep going down the line, till they reached the smallest stations. In Nowheresville, Wyoming, a cornfield in Iowa with no TVs or people within a 10-mile radius, and Atlantis. So unlike the CBS version, syndicated shows wouldn't air on the same day everywhere, which was also the case for Match Game PM. So you couldn't do holiday specials or ring in the new year in syndication. But hey, Match Game was back on the air. It technically hadn't left yet, but you know what I mean. This version had a slightly different format. They still had the Star Wheel and games that straddled across episodes and all that jazz, but there were no returning champions. Instead, 2 new contestants were introduced at a time, and they'd each play 2 full games, 4 rounds and 2 super matches in total. They played 6 games every week over the course of 5 shows, with 3 pairs of contestants. Weird format, but sure, why not? Brett Summers and Charles Nelson Riley returned as regular panelists, and all the semi-regulars continued to appear as well. What used to be Richard Dawson's seat became the spot for semi-regular male panelists, including Bill Daly, Dick Martin, and Gary Berghoff. Eventually, McLean Stevenson became a regular panelist, towards the end of the syndicated show's runs. The daytime syndicated version is also where we got one of the most famous terrible answers in the show's history. Ginger won the game and earned $250 in the audience match. The head-to-head match prompt was Cuckoo Blank. I think it's fair to say the definitive answer is Cuckoo Clock. Well, that wasn't her answer to say the least.
Cuckoo Friend and Ollie.
Ooh, not quite. She was thinking of Kukla, Fran and Ollie, a TV show with puppets that aired in the 40s and 50s.
Now wait a minute. Now wait, he could say it. It's possible he's got that on that card.
No, it's not.
Cuckoo Fran and Ollie.
I said accordion.
Alright, I'm gone.
No, you didn't.
I said...
That's why it didn't work.
Cuckoo clock.
Match Game PM came to an end in 1981, with the nighttime Family Feud expanding to 5 nights a week. With more and more stations signing up to air Feud, there simply wasn't room for Match Game After Dark anymore. The daytime show continued for another season though, ending its run in 1982. The 1973 to 82 era of the show is still popular to this day though, airing daily reruns on Buzzer and Game Show Network. Because Mark Goodson was one of the first people to say, hey, maybe we shouldn't throw all our shows in the trash? At the time, most companies wiped episodes after they aired, so they could reuse the tapes. So unlike most of the shows that came before it, nearly the entirety of Match Game 73 and beyond exists to this day. In 1983, NBC picked up a new soap opera called Santa Barbara, and it was set to air in the 3 p.m. time slot. But it was a more complex production than most soaps that came before it, so they needed a different hour-long show to fill that time slot till it was ready. That show ended up being Match Game Hollywood Squares Hour, a crossover between, well, you can do the math. And although it just started out keeping a time slot warm for another show, it had a chance to be renewed and moved to a new time if it did well. It did not. So here's the rub. 2 new contestants kicked off the show with Match Game. They each got 3 questions a la Match Game PM, and the winner moved on to play Hollywood Squares against the last show's champion. The winner of Hollywood Squares played the bonus round, a revamped version of the Super Match. Now the top audience match answer is worth $1,000, and the star wheel was gone. The contestant can pick any of the 9 celebrities for the head-to-head match, like they could before 1978. But this time, each star had a random multiplier, either 10, 20, or 30. So if they matched, the contestant could win up to $30,000, which is a lot of money for a daytime show. In a previous video, I mentioned that if you adjust for inflation, that's about $90,000 in today's money. Granted, there was only a 1 in 9 chance you found the 30 times multiplier, but you can't get close to that kind of money on most daytime game shows. Originally, the show would have started with 3 contestants playing Match Game. After a couple of rounds, the lowest scorer would be eliminated, and the 2 remaining players would move on to Hollywood Squares. This would have made it the only version of Match Game with more than 2 players or teams. But they went back to 2 contestants by the time the show premiered on Halloween 1983. But there were a lot of problems with the show that led to its cancellation after just 1 season. First off, there were 2 hosts. One was Gene Rayburn, reprising the role he's held on and off for over 2 decades at this point. The original plan was to have Gene host the full hour, including Hollywood Squares. But NBC insisted they find a second host for some reason, so they wound up choosing John Bauman to host the Hollywood Squares half of the show. At that point, Bauman was better known as Bowser, his alter ego in the band Sha-Na-Na. Not to be confused with Bowser with an S. I'm pretty sure Bauman wasn't kidnapping princesses before this gig. Pretty sure. Bauman had previously appeared on game shows like Match Game and Password Plus as Bowser, but now he was hosting Hollywood Squares as John Bauman. He was also a regular panelist on the Match Game half of the show, with Rayburn taking his seat during Squares. So suddenly, despite the efforts to get him to host the whole show, Gene found himself in a similar position to Richard Dawson a few years earlier. He was in control for half the show, but second banana for the other half, which he wasn't a fan of. Early on the show's run, whenever a contestant called on Gene for the first time in Hollywood Squares, John had to do a disclaimer, saying that despite being the host of the Match Game portion, Gene hadn't seen the Squares questions before the show, and similarly, John hadn't seen the Match Game questions. Having 2 hosts just made things way more complicated than they had to be. Another problem was that the panel didn't have any regulars, besides John of course. Charles Nelson Riley, Marsha Wallace, McLean Stevenson, and Fannie Flagg all made occasional appearances, and so did several other guests from the previous versions of Match Game, but they weren't fixtures like they used to be. The thing is, when the show was built so heavily around Brett, Charles, and Richard for so long, the Match Game portion of the show can feel a little bit flat by comparison. Don't get me wrong, the Match Game half of the show was still fun, but it's not quite as good as the CBS or syndicated versions that came before it in my opinion. The Hollywood Squares half though? Woof. That couldn't hold a candle to the versions that came before or after it, and that was mostly because of Mark Goodson's changes to the show. Every version of Hollywood Squares follows a similar format. 2 contestants play tic-tac-toe by answering trivia questions, asterisk. Instead of being asked the questions directly, they had to pick a celebrity to answer for them. Then they decided if they agree or disagree with the star's answer. If they get it right, they get the square. If they get it wrong, the square goes to their opponent. First to make 3 in a row or get 5 total squares wins the round, and they play till they run out of time. Now, here's the problem with this version of Hollywood Squares. Goodson absolutely butchered it to Kingdom Come, then butchered it some more. On every other version of the show, the questions were usually open-ended, giving the stars a chance to give a joke answer, or zinger as they call it, before their actual answer. So, like Match Game, Hollywood Squares focuses pretty heavily on comedy. Not on Goodson's watch, though. His problem with the format was that celebrities were given pre-written zingers before the show, and they were told the topics of the questions when they were briefed as well. Goodson compared it to the rigged game shows from the 1950s, even though the stars have to come up with their own actual answers, and the contestants are still coming in blind. He hated Hollywood Squares format, so much so that he published an essay about his problems with the show. He took the reins and turned it into something he liked. And like, I understand not wanting a game show to be partially scripted, but an unscripted format really isn't compatible with Hollywood Squares. It made the show so unfunny and awkward. And to make things even worse, the questions were multiple choice or true-false, leaving even less room to be funny. So if I were to watch an episode of Hollywood Squares, I'd much rather watch literally any other version of the show. And besides the fact that a celebrity panel is involved, Match Game and Hollywood Squares aren't very similar shows at all. So a lot of the time, you would get stars and contestants who are good at Hollywood Squares, but bad at Match Game, or vice versa. Think about it this way. On Jeopardy, you just need to be good at trivia. On Password or Pyramid, you just need to be good at giving and understanding clues. On Wheel of Fortune, you just need to be able to spell. On Family Feud, you don't need to be good at anything. Match Game Hollywood Squares Hour needed you to be good at trivia, but also fill in the blank survey games. So you wouldn't always get people who are strong players in both halves of the show. Granted, you did have to win Match Game to make it to Hollywood Squares, but that doesn't necessarily mean they played well. Somebody's gotta limp their way to a victory at some point. Here's a game that was still scoreless after 3 rounds.
Alright, now hold everything, we gotta go to the tiebreaker now.
On top of all of that, Match Game had 6 panelists and Hollywood Squares had 9. So every episode, there would be 3 stars just sitting backstage during Match Game, waiting for Hollywood Squares to start. They somewhat mitigated the problem by rotating which 3 celebrities only played Hollywood Squares each day, so everybody got a chance to play Match Game during the week. But that meant Gene was working with a slightly different panel every day, so he wasn't able to connect with the celebrities the same way he could on CBS. So Match Game Hollywood Squares was cancelled after 1 season, and Santa Barbara took its place on the schedule. Over the next few years, several attempts were made to revive Match Game as a standalone show again, and thank God for that. Unfortunately, a lot of these attempts failed for various reasons. A syndicated version was in the works for 1985, which would have featured Rayburn reprising his hosting role once again. But that didn't come to fruition, because he was already committed to hosting another game show for the 1985-86 season, Break the Bank, and he wound up hating that show. The main game isn't the worst thing in the universe, but it goes downhill fast. 2 couples answer trivia questions, and the answers are clues to a puzzle a la Password Plus or Super Password. First team to solve 2 puzzles wins the game and moves on to the prize vault round. Are you ready for the nonsense? Answer trivia questions about animals. There's stuffed animals flying in from off screen because of course there are. Jog in place. Do a little dancey dance. Run in a circle. Now go the other way. Do 10 push-ups. Is your heart rate 1,000 beats per minute yet? Good. Ding dong. Give me a hug. Now give me a hug. Now give me a kiss. Whee! Yeah, it's a lot. It's basically beat the clock stunts on crack. It was way too chaotic for its own good. The whole round was a mess because they were doing all the stunts on 1 time limit. So they raced through them all trying to fit as many as they could. Everything being so rushed meant Gene was prone to stumbling through the questions he was reading, and not all of the stunts played out the way they intended. Gene wasn't a fan of the show, and I don't blame him. He wound up being fired at the end of 1985, and he was replaced by Joe Farrago. They tried reviving Match Game again in 1987, but that didn't happen either. A shocking secret about Gene Rayburn was revealed, which he said prevented him from getting other gigs as well. What heinous scandal prevented him from getting other jobs? Being 68 years old. How dare he? I guess. Yep, that's it. Rayburn kept his age a secret for most of his career, but Entertainment Tonight had a segment where they wished celebrities a happy birthday. In 1985, they wished Rayburn a happy 68th, which is a lot older than most producers thought he was. But like, it's not like 68, 69, 70-year-olds don't host game shows. Pat Sajak is still hosting Wheel of Fortune at age 76. Alex Trebek hosted Jeopardy until his death at age 80. Bob Barker hosted The Price is Right until he was like 1,000. I'll admit it's not an apples-to-apples comparison, because they all turned 68 after the failed Match Game revivals. Plus, they were just continuing to host shows they were already on, unlike Rayburn who was doing revival after revival. But either way, Rayburn says being wished a happy zillionth birthday made it a lot harder to find work. But we did get 2 revivals in the 90s, and they shook up the tried and true format quite a bit. ABC ordered a daytime version of Match Game in 1989, and Bert Convey of Tattletales and Super Password fame hosted the pilots. Convey was on previous versions of Match Game a handful of times, including the pilots for Match Game 73, so this ain't his first rodeo. Charles Nelson Riley was also set to return as a regular panelist. Some more familiar faces from the 70s version popped up from time to time, including Betty White, Marcia Wallace, and even Brett Summers. Unfortunately, a few months before the show was scheduled to premiere in 1990, Convey was diagnosed with a terminal brain tumor, so they had to find a new host. They wound up picking Ross Schaefer, who had previously hosted The Late Show, as well as a dating game show called Love Me, Love Me Not. On this version, which I'll call Match Game 90, each match was worth $50, and contestants could match the same celebrity in both rounds. So the main rounds were worth up to $600 with 12 matches on the table. Wait, that sounded wrong. This version introduced a matchup round, which gave contestants a chance to earn more money. They were given a series of super match prompts, but this time they were multiple choice. The contestant picked from 2 possible answers and locked in their choice secretly. Then the celebrity they chose to play with tried to match them.
Let's make love, let's make a deal.
Let's make a deal.
Match. Screen blank. Screen door, screen test.
Screen door.
No match.
They got 30 seconds in the first matchup round, and each match was worth $50. Then the second one was 45 seconds and $100 a match. This is one of the weirdest elements of any version of Match Game, but you know what? I don't hate it. It feels like a natural way to expand the game, since it was basically a lightning round of super matches. The Super Match round proper was similar to the 70s version. One audience match worth up to $500, and the Star Wheel returned for the head-to-head match, which once again could be played for up to $10,000. A step down from Match Game Hollywood Squares, but $10,000 is nothing to sneeze at. Scratch that. If you're watching Match Game 90 because you're homesick during a school day, then yeah, I guess it is something to sneeze at. Yup, this show aired at noon, so it wasn't something a lot of people had the chance to watch. You know another reason not a lot of people watched it? Because it straight up didn't air in a lot of markets. ABC stations had the option to air either Match Game or local news at 12, and a lot of stations chose to do news. If they did the news, Match Game might be sent to the shadow realm of local independent stations that nobody will ever watch, or not be aired at all. So this version only lasted 1 season and it was off the air by 1991. Taking over its time slot was The Home Show, which was expanded from 60 to 90 minutes for the 1991-92 season. In the series finale, Ross Schaefer talked about a second season airing on another network, but that didn't come to pass unfortunately. In 1996, there was yet another pilot for a new version of Match Game, hosted by Charlene Tilton. This time it was called MG2, The Match Game. If I'm not mistaken, we're on like MG7, but who's counting, I guess? Speaking of counting, the pilot only featured 5 celebrities instead of 6. MG2 returned to playing for points instead of money in the main game, but in this version, everybody wrote down their answers and the celebrities revealed theirs before the contestant. And I'm just sitting here like, hey man, the old format worked, verbal responses from the contestants work, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. They also shook up the bonus round. They still had an audience match, but it came second this time. The first part of the bonus round was called the panel poll, where the stars answered multiple choice personality questions. Stuff like, would the movie about your life be a comedy, drama, or horror flick? The contestant had to pick the answer they thought the most celebrities chose. The first question was worth $100 per match, and the second was $200 per match. Then the audience match had 3 top answers like usual, but they multiplied the contestants' winnings by 2, 3, or 5. Sure. That pilot didn't get picked up, but Match Game returned to syndication in 1998. This time it was hosted by Michael Berger. Fantastic last name, by the way. And once again, it featured 5 panelists per show, including Vicki Lawrence, Judy Tenuta, Nell Carter, and George Hamilton. This show returned to 2 rounds, but now the second round was worth double points. On other versions of the show, there were 2 cards and the first contestant picked between question A and question B. But on Match Game 98, they were shown 2 categories, an element that came from the failed MG2 pilot. The categories were also puns, like Suit Yourself or 20,000 Leagues Under the Sheets. Sure, why not? But once again, this show only lasted 1 season. In 2006, Ricky Lake hosted a special series called Game Show Marathon, an American adaptation of a British show with the same name. 6 celebrities battled it out in a tournament of classic game shows over the course of 7 episodes. The quarterfinal games were The Price is Right, Beat the Clock, Press Your Luck, and Let's Make a Deal. The winners of those games moved on to play Card Sharks and Match Game in the semifinals. Paige Davis and Brandy Roderick played Card Sharks, leaving Lance Bass and Kathy Najimy to play Match Game. Each episode of Game Show Marathon was an hour long, so they played with Match Game PM rules. 3 rounds and 2 audience matches. Najimy won 5-3 and moved on to the super match. During Game Show Marathon, all the money the contestants won before the finals was given away to viewers, and Match Game gave her a chance to win somebody at home up to $50,000. Najimy got the top answers in both audience matches, winning $1,000 with Supermarket and Purple Rain. She played the head-to-head match with George Foreman to multiply that by 50, and the prompt was Blank Kong. I think there's 3 good answers to this one. Hong Kong, King Kong, and Donkey Kong. So let's see if they match.
Kong, K-O-N-G?
Yes.
It would be King. No?
All you have to do, George, is come up with King. Now, I don't know. Did he do it? He said It's a match!
We did it.
Good job, George. Nice job.
Very nice. Kathy and Jimmy had won $50,000 for a viewer, and she also went on to defeat Brandy Roderick and Family Feud in the finals, winning $100,000 for charity. Not bad. A couple more failed pilots for revivals of the show were made in the 2000s. In 2004, Fox made a pilot called What the Blank, which would have been a primetime affair hosted by Fred Willard. TBS also made a pilot in 2008, hosted by Andy Daly. Oh my. Yeah, this is a more one-to-one recreation of the 70s version of the show, set, music, and all. Unfortunately, the celebrities had no clue how to play the game.
Is it against the rules to look at somebody else's card? Because I don't know if what I have is correct.
What the H?
Ma'am, this is Match Game. There is no one right answer. The biggest difference between this pilot and the 70s version is the Super Match. It works more like Family Feud's Fast Money Round. The host asks 5 fill-in-the-blank questions rapid fire, and you have to come up with the number 1 answer. Once you're done, you can change a couple answers with the help of the stars. Each top answer is worth $1,000. Then the head-to-head match doubles your money.
I don't think you know what sex is.
What is going on?
The feces of a gorilla is the same as a banana.
Alright, moving on. In recent years, ABC has revived a ton of classic game show formats in primetime. And of course I wouldn't be talking about this if Match Game wasn't one of the shows they've done. After the success of Celebrity Family Feud in 2015, ABC started working on more game shows for a brand new Sunday Fun and Games block. Alec Baldwin was chosen to host Match Game, and it premiered on June 26, 2016, alongside the $100,000 Pyramid with Michael Strahan. The Baldwin version's gameplay and presentation are pretty similar to the 1970s versions of the show, but not as much so as the TBS pilot. The theme music is an updated version of the 70s theme, and so are a lot of the graphics. 2 contestants play 2 rounds, and try to match as many celebrities as they can. The panel is back to 6 stars, 6 very, very drunk stars, as opposed to 5 in Match Game 98. The audience match answers were worth $5,000, $3,000, and $2,000. Then the head-to-head match can multiply that by 5. So the maximum possible payday on this version is $25,000, which I find kinda interesting. I talked about this in my video about prize money, but that's less than the maximum possible prize on Match Game Hollywood Squares. This is one of the only recent ABC game shows where the cash isn't through the roof. Most of their other shows can send people home with 6 or even 7 figures. I mean, I guess if you somehow snuck on the show with 4 different disguises, you could win $100,000 on this version, but I wouldn't count on pulling that off. Press your luck's maximum prize is $1 million, which makes Match Game 16's money look like pocket change. I don't think that's a bad thing, though. Not every primetime game show needs an absurd price tag attached to it, and Match Game 16 is a good example of that. It's great that it coexists alongside the awesome big money shows we have. Match Game 16 was also expanded to an hour-long format. Unlike the Match Game Hollywood Squares hour, though, they doubled the length of the show by simply playing 2 games of Match Game, each with a different pair of contestants, which is something a lot of other ABC game shows do as well. Supermarket Sweep, Pyramid, and Celebrity Family Feud do 2 games in an hour as well. And I think it's a good time. It's a fun show to watch, and I also like it as a content creator, because this is the first Match Game to be broadcast in widescreen and HD. So if I talk about Match Game during a general game show discussion video, I can use footage from this version, since HD video is obviously gonna look nicer. You know how some TV shows will celebrate their 100th or 1000th or 1,000,000th episode? Well, Match Game 16 did the same thing, sort of. In September 2020, they celebrated their 58th episode, which is awesome. Celebrating random numbers like that will never not be funny to me. Catch me making a game show and having a 314th episode celebration, cause that's 100 pi. I'm a freaking dork. Anyway, as part of the 58th episode special, the audience match answers were worth an extra $58, which I think is just lovely. Although I think they missed an opportunity here. They could have made the head-to-head match multiply their winnings by 5.8. Imagine going home and telling your friends, yeah man, I won $29,336.40 on Match Game. Oh my god, just say you won $30,000. Okay, maybe not. This episode is so stupid, I love it. Oh, by the way, if you're watching this video in the distant future and there actually are TV shows with 1,000,000 episodes, leave a comment. Unless YouTube got rid of those too. Ugh. Well, that'll do it for this video. The Baldwin version of Match Game was cancelled in 2021, so that's all I got for now. Be sure to subscribe for more game show videos like this, and leave a comment letting me know what else you'd like to see me cover. I'll see you all next time. Good night, fellas. Sleep well.